that my research showed were developed at the behest of the Office of Naval Research to work with gifted and psychic children in specialized education, advanced education. Mm-hmm. In my case, I was given, in 3 years of grammar school, in my 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, I was placed in a learning laboratory where I was given sort of a university history program in everything involving society and science in particular, science and applied technology, applied science, from the year 1450, which would be the High Renaissance, which we would associate with, for example, Galileo. In fact, the name of this curriculum was Galileo. And the machines had been developed at the instruction of the Office of Naval Research. They were designed at one of my father's former employers, which was the Thomas A. Edison Research Laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey. No connection to Edison. This, in fact, was a defense R&D think tank-like engineering company that was founded in around 1950. But it was actually physically adjacent to Edison's old labs in West Orange. In fact, it shared a common doorway that was always locked with the old Edison labs that Mrs. Clinton refurbished and made into a national park when President Clinton was president. And she realized that Edison's labs had been laying fallow for decades and had been ignored by the American people and government. So my dad was working at the Edison labs from 1956 to 64, and during that time, these speed learning machines for gifted students were actually constructed at the Edison labs. And they had taught us how to photo read. So we were getting all this history of society and history of science and technology crammed into our heads during those 3 years of grammar school. And in fact, there were U.S. Army field hospital cots in the learning lab that we used to collapse onto and fall asleep because we were so exhausted after, let's say, 2 hours of standing there and doing all this saturation learning.
This is at age 8?
I beg your pardon?
Sorry, this was at age 8?
I was in the learning lab from fall of 1969 to spring of 1972. So that would have been, I was 7 going on 8 when the 3rd grade began for me, which would have been fall of 69. And I remember around October, I would guess maybe around October 5th of 1969 or so, I signed my security oath on U.S. Defense Department letterhead. In other words, we started school in September, we were placed in the learning lab, and right away there in fall of 69, they let us know that we were in a U.S. Defense Department, classified research and development program. We were being trained for it. So they had us sign a secrecy oath, kind of a loyalty oath, and they began immersing us not only in the speed learning, but in parapsychological testing and training. And very quickly, they began to involve us in very far-out stuff that was going on off campus. And so I can describe that a little bit later in this interview. But so this showing me that this Martian and telling me that I was going to be responsible for discovering it on the surface of Mars was pretty heady stuff, but it was the kind of stuff that was going on in my life around that time. I had already been dropped into Pegasus. I'm guessing this was probably after I'd been dropped into Pegasus. It might have been the summer beforehand. It might have been, let's say, summer of 70, but it was around that age when I first started receiving the specialized education that I was given by the Defense Department to later be involved in the quantum access activities that I would be over the course of those next 3 years. But they definitely had the Mars data because my dad showed me that very photograph of the Martian that's in the paper. Now, the third Mars data point that I've recollected is around 1970. This was definitely after my father had showed me the picture. My dad's, and after we were already teleporting from building the teleported in building 68 at the Curtiss Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey. We were always jumping through a device there to the state capitol complex in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So after I had already done that with my dad once in 67, 68 when I was 6 years old, and then after I'd already been doing it during summer of 70 with the kids in my learning lab who were by that point attached to Project Pegasus and actively, if you will, time traveling. At least we were already teleporting back and forth between New Jersey and New Mexico. My dad said on a Saturday morning, I'm guessing, this might have been around spring of 70, or actually, no, it had to be after we were already teleporting as a group. This must have been around fall of 70, because I know it was after we were already, I had already teleported with the other children in the program in summer of 70. So fall of 70 or thereabouts, my father says, come on, Andy, we're going over to Curtis Wright. And I get in the car, and I'd always been, I've been trained how to keep project information secret, so I waited to get into the car, and he closed, his door. And I said, Dad, are we teleporting to New Mexico? And he said, no, I'm taking you over to Curtis Wright because there are some Martians there that I want you to meet. And again, I had forgotten the earlier incident involving reading the passages from the paper and him showing me the photograph. This was another unusual event in my childhood in which he was bringing Mars up. And I said, what do you mean Martians? As we drove over from our home in Morris Plains, New Jersey, to Curtis Wright in Woodridge, New Jersey, I really couldn't get my mind around what he was talking about. And my dad got exasperated, which was very unusual for him. He was a very thoughtful and intelligent man, and he was really an ideal father in terms of being patient with children and educating us about things. And he always used a very advanced vocabulary, and he would always explain things very thoroughly and very patiently. But I had asked for most of the 15-minute trip over to Curtis Wright, I said, what do you mean, Dad, Martians? I don't get it. And he pulled the car over to the side of the road, and he said, Martians, son, they're human beings like us, except they're from Mars. And he had, lost his patience. So I said, oh, okay, I get it. So we drove over to Curtis Wright, and we didn't enter Building 68. We entered a different building. And this building was like an Air Force hangar that had a huge concrete loading dock that we actually walked out onto as we entered this big building. It was like a huge Quonset hut over a concrete loading dock. And I looked over to the right near the edge of the loading dock, and you could see that maybe twice as far beyond that. Maybe the loading dock was about 150 feet of concrete from the door to the edge of the loading dock, and there was maybe another 100 feet of concrete that was actually went out to the tarmac there at Curtis Wright. So it was one of those big Air Force hangars where they put planes. And over on the edge of the stage, or this loading dock-like platform that we were walking across, there was a small silver metallic spaceship. It wasn't circular. It wasn't a flying saucer. It looked teardrop shaped. It looked basically like a silver flying Z-type car. What is that? A Honda Z?
Something like that.
Like a flying Camaro or Suzuki or Honda Z-type automobiles. In other words, it was an aerodynamically designed spaceship, but it wasn't a flying saucer. It was bilateral, but it looked more like an automobile without tires than a flying saucer. And something that clearly hasn't been depicted very frequently in the UFO literature. And it was just hovering there, and I could hear it going put, 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 like it was riding on a cushion of air. And we went into an office that was right adjacent to this huge, cavernous aircraft hangar. And there's hardly anything in it. I mean, it was just this big, empty concrete space with this silver ship hanging over there, and there were these big lights that were illuminating the whole hangar. And there was a brief discussion with these three men in a small conference room with just some basic furniture, almost like those little briefing rooms you see the astronauts being briefed in before they then walk across the tarmac and get into the space shuttle or whatever. It was just a small little utilitarian briefing room where people would get coffee, who were on the project. And these men were essentially human, but for one thing, they were speaking in a very high-pitched way, with very high-pitched voices, almost as if they were straining their vocal cords and yet had very high voices. And they were just talking shop, and I didn't understand hardly anything they were talking about. They were talking aerospace. And then they said, well, I guess it is time for us to leave. Or maybe some kind of attaché came into the room and told them it was time to leave or whatever. So we walked out of this little room and back into the hangar area. And I turned, and my dad turned, and these three guys walked right past me. And the best way I can describe how they looked to